All right, so recording has started. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have a great conversation here today. I'm with Dr. Kelsie Lazzell. She's one of our providers at the Crifase Institute. And today we are going to be talking about Hashimoto's disease. This is a really prevalent thyroid condition. It's an autoimmune thyroid condition that's rampant among the entire United States and the world. And so we have a fantastic doctor here today, Dr. Kelsie Lazzell. Thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen because we have a PowerPoint to go over today. So we are going to do that and jump right into the presentation. So let me share my screen here. And let's start the presentation. So this is a case history of Hashimoto's autoimmune hypothyroid. Again, very, very common condition, and today we're going to go over a high-level overview of how we help to manage this type of condition in our practice. This is a very clinical style case review here. We're not going to be talking a lot about lifestyle or anything like this. It's very heavy on labs and what we take from a very clinical perspective for patients. So, Kelsie, if you would, please, can you walk us through this case history for this patient? And this was your patient.
Yeah, so this was a 64-year-old female who presented originally with concerns of weight gain, inability to lose weight. She had very high anxiety. She didn't even mention anything particularly about her thyroid, had never really had her thyroid numbers tested in the past beyond a simple TSH, which had probably been 5 to 10 years the last time that was ran for her. So just based off of what else she presented with, particularly, I just noticed some very dry hands, feet, even the skin on her neck was definitely standing out. She didn't have any overt hair loss. And due to her age, we couldn't really use any, menstrual factors as potential symptoms with the thyroid condition. Just kind of jumping back into the notes specifically. So she was about 5'7", presented 251 pounds. So definitely a nice elevated BMI there. Family history, her dad had been on thyroid medication for as long as she could remember when he was alive. She didn't remember exactly what type of thyroid issue he had. Her mom was dealing with some type 1 diabetes that she had gotten diagnosed with when she was in her early 20s following a viral infection. And her daughter was medicated for Hashimoto's as well. And I think they found that out because she was having trouble getting pregnant. So she saw a fertility specialist. They ran the whole gambit of labs and found out that she was Hashimoto's as well. Diet was pretty good considering, pretty limited breakfast. To lunch was pretty standard. She had a salad almost every single day. And dinner was beautiful. She had fish at least once a week, stuck to lean proteins, nice quality vegetables in there, some good fats as well. And she really did a good job rotating between meat-based proteins and plant-based proteins as well to diversify nutrient intake.
Thanks for that, Dr. Kelsie. And this is a really important slide because obviously this is the first slide of this presentation, but there's a lot of good points here that we want to go over here, talking points. And not only that, just for you that are watching, this is kind of a brief glimpse into what our notes as providers look like, what we want to look for with patients, and really analyze from a functional medicine perspective. So let's start at the top here, Kelsie. I just want to go over some of these points. This type of case history and patient presentation is really common for thyroid patients. They are usually have some sort of weight gain, anxiety. They can't lose the weight. And while this patient didn't have any hair loss noted, which is usually a little more abnormal, usually there's a lot of hair loss noted, they do have that very typical or textbook, very dry skin on the hands, feet, legs, and arms. So can you talk a little bit, Kelsie, about why thyroid patients and Hashimoto's patients usually have these types of symptoms in particular?
Yeah, so a lot of it, I kind of break it down into the fact that your thyroid is your master controller of your metabolism. So if we're dealing with a case of hypothyroid, everything's essentially slowed down. Metabolism is slowed down. That's why we're seeing some of this weight gain. In terms of the dry skin, slower cell turnover, inability to kind of produce that good oil that's going to do a nice job of maintaining moisture in the skin, as well as just the fact that I didn't write it on here, but she was drinking very little water as well. So that's why we did a little more investigation into thyroid. Yeah.
Exactly. I think you brought up some really good points there, and as you mentioned, you just don't have enough cell turnover, and with the lack of water consumption, that really means that this patient was not potentially also stimulating those proper organs like her gallbladder and her pancreas to really release their corresponding digestive enzymes, so that she actually absorbs those fats and those other nutrients into her cells, thereby giving a healthy, vibrant look to in the entire body, which again is related back to that thyroid with just turning down that metabolism, that internal thermostat where everything just starts slowing down, including the function of the organs. So thanks for going into that. That's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And the second point I want to talk about here, Kelsie, is his family history. Clearly, this patient had some sort of maybe genetic lineage and genetic predisposition to a thyroid problem. Can you talk a little bit about how common this is and how we kind of can assess this with the patient as well?
Yeah. So whenever we're talking about genetics, I mean, we always like to start off with the fact that, genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. So you can have a nice family history of thyroid imbalance, but not have any personally yourself. So don't get too scared that if your mom has a thyroid issue, you're definitely going to have one. That might not be the case. For this patient particularly, a couple other lifestyle factors were lacking. Again, her diet definitely was good overall, but had some areas for improvement. Movement and exercise was not something regular, routine in her, weekly regimen. And digestive health was definitely lacking as well. I believe we talk about that a little bit later. She definitely had some slow transit, borderline constipation at times. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, circling this back to family history, I mean, there is a very strong genetic connection there. One of the things I always like to point out is gluten being a related factor. So, particularly with her family, the father and the daughter, some of us can have actually a genetic variation in our DNA that causes us to attack gluten the same way that we're attacking our thyroid cells. So, if this was the case for this patient, we're definitely going to see that, genetic predisposition carrying through her family line, just even based off of that alone.
Fantastic. And you did mention that the genetics is that gun, but you got to pull that trigger. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because there is said to be that three-legged stool of autoimmunity, especially when we're talking about Hashimoto's, which is truly an autoimmune condition. And that is that genetics, that is those lifestyle factors, and then that is that intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut, which I'm sure we'll go over here. And then finally, I just want to break this down, this last section here with you, Dr. Kelsie, and that is diet. You mentioned this patient has a pretty good diet here overall. There's a lot of variation, which is what the microbiome appreciates. There's a lot of different good fats and good different types of proteins between plant and animal in here. But the question is, you have so many patients out there who seem to be doing all of the right things. Maybe they now have a great diet. Maybe they now are able to get to the gym, but they're still suffering with these different types of conditions. Can you talk a little bit about why that might be, as these obviously don't develop overnight, but even if you are doing all of the right things, why these types of conditions can, one, develop and then persist even while you're doing some of the main lifestyle strategies that are going to be giving you a vibrant life in general in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, something I always like to relate it back to is gut health. You can be doing absolutely everything right, eating beautiful plant-based diets, lean proteins, all the good healthy fats we want to see. But if you're potentially not cooking your meat well enough, if you eat a lot of sushi, you eat a lot of raw fish, you're traveling a lot overseas to new environments, new water that you're drinking, all of these can potentially expose your gastrointestinal tract to either pathogenic bacteria, parasites, other nasty bugs that can cause either overgrowths of bugs, which we call dysbiosis. And a lot of this can lead to disruption of that nice, beautiful gut lining integrity that you actually just mentioned, that leaky gut. That is something we always relate back to whenever we're starting with autoimmune conditions. I always want to look at the person's gut. I want to look at the microbiome. I want to look at inflammation in the gut lining. I want to look and see if there's any eosinophilic protein being released that could be related to a food intolerance, food allergies, food sensitivities. Again, she was eating a salad every single day, so that's fantastic. I love to see that, the good fiber, the good vegetables. However, she was eating the same romaine lettuce every single day, topping it with the same vegetables, putting the same nuts and seeds on there. So when we have that habitual eating like that, that in itself can cause our body to start to react to some of these foods. Again, bringing it back to the microbiome. If there is any disruption of that microbiome, say she was a C-section baby, she was bottle fed, she might not have had that good bacterial introduction that she had being, from a nice vaginal birth. She didn't get that nice skin to skin contact because she was bottle fed. So this could have really tied back to her, first year or two in life. She potentially could have had a viral infection or a viral gastrointestinal infection that led to some bacterial overgrowth, E. coli, something nasty in the gut that could have led again to that leaky gut. So I see this all the time. Some of my healthiest patients will come in being like, I exercise 5 days a week. I do the sauna. I do everything right. I eat this beautiful diet. Why do I still have an autoimmune disease? So again, it is kind of tough for us to make that connection between A and B when we have so many potential years and lifestyle factors that we can't really address everything in that first visit. So it is just kind of teasing through the history, seeing what really stands out to us and what we can, essentially investigate further.
Absolutely. Thank you for putting that so thoroughly. The bottom line, as you put, Dr. Kelsie, is there's so many factors here. And even while you might think that you might be doing all of the right things, this is why taking a very individualized biochemical uniqueness approach to your particular history is why we follow this functional medicine route and model. And this is why it's so important, as you cannot give the same treatment for 10 different people because everybody is so unique. And even when you think you might be doing all the great things, just diet here looks fine. For the most part, looks really not terrible. You can still develop these things that are unexpected, and over time they can accumulate and get worse. And so this is, as you put, Dr. Kelsie, why the program that we work with all of our patients is so in depth, and it takes time to work on a lot of these things, and includes things like that stool test you mentioned. So thank you. I know this was a lot of information we just covered in a single slide, and we have a lot more to go. But this, I just wanted for you all watching to give you a little bit of a glimpse and an insight into how we really need to analyze each patient's history so that we're doing the best possible care for you. So let's move on to the second slide here. So Dr. Kelsie, please, can you explain your first office call, the labs, and your clinical thought process here?
Yeah, so again, based off of her presentation, family history, I definitely wanted a full thyroid panel. There's a couple nutrients that are essential to thyroid function as well that I wanted to look at. Iodine, as we know, is definitely one of the most important when it comes to thyroid health, and that is one of our most devoid nutrients in our food, especially here in the United States. Selenium, zinc, also, a little tough to get in our food, and always good to look at those. If she did have any compromised digestion, she could be eating the right foods to get this stuff in. She was eating fish once a week. But what if she's not absorbing it? So before she ran the labs, I did have her stop her iodine supplementation that she had been doing on her own, on and off for a few years. And she actually just did that because she felt great. Her energy really boosted when she was doing the iodine. So had her stop that because we wanted to get a more accurate lab draw with that iodine level. So if she was still supplementing the day before, that's essentially what we're going to see in her blood. So had her stop that. And then we just did some basic dietary work as well, increasing protein, just making sure that she had enough protein coming in to help support cell turnover in the gut, as well as support the thyroid function. What did I mention? Oh, specifically kind of diversifying, again, some of those protein sources. And I mentioned the nuts and seeds. Those are definitely two of my favorite sources for good fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids, protein, as well as zinc and selenium, which are pretty, tough to get in some of our other foods.
Beautiful, beautiful. A lot of good points here. And I just want to touch on one thing, and that is you told the patient to stop iodine. This is something that we talk about in some of our video courses that we have at the Crifase Institute is timing of supplementation and timing of labs. So Dr. Kelsie, can you again just mention why you needed and you told that patient to stop iodine supplementation and what that means for a patient running labs, and how, whether it's iodine or it's another supplement, how that can interfere with any sort of lab marker, as well as the timing of some of these markers. Certain markers such as TSH and some of these other things are elevated at certain times of day, just as your cortisol and other hormones are. And so this is something that we always have to look at the timing of when a patient is getting their labs drawn, as well as any precursors to that. So if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because with her specifically, we are having her, every time we follow up with her thyroid panel, we're having her go at the same time every time she gets the draw. And we're also trying to take into account the fact that if she's going in the summer versus the winter, we're going to be getting some different values as well, because In the summer, the thyroid doesn't need to be as active to maintain that good body temperature, so we will see a little bit of a dip in some of those numbers. In regards to the iodine itself, so again, if she is continually supplementing with iodine daily, that's essentially the levels that we're going to see in her blood. This test itself isn't the most accurate. What I would have liked to do would be a 24-hour urine catch, and then we'd actually look at her iodine levels based off of that. But that wasn't available to us at the moment, so we thought this would be a good place to start. Another reason I always want to run this is iodine supplementation with thyroid autoimmune markers can drive those through the roof. It kind of, I think you might have mentioned this, Anthony, but there is mixed information and mixed results out there as to whether iodine can stimulate autoimmune flare when it comes to Hashimoto's or support it. So for someone like her, we wanted to make sure we knew that iodine level, because if it was nice and low, we would have continually given her the iodine while watching those numbers to make sure that those autoimmune markers didn't go up, so we could hit a nice iodine level for her without doing the arduous, take the iodine, do a 24-hour urinary catch, and then send that into the lab.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very true statement, Dr. Kelsie. There is that two sides of the coin there. Some literature, and some experts say that there is some sort of flare that can occur, and then some say that there can't with iodine supplementation. Again, two sides of the party here. Either way, we want to make sure that we're getting a standard and good rough estimate of where they're at without that supplementation to start off with, so we have a baseline at least to know where we're going. So thanks for touching on that. So let's move on to the next slide here, which is kind of the lab results that came back. If you can touch on these, Dr. Kelsie.
Yeah, so just starting right off the bat, one thing I want to point out that I kind of skipped over on the first slide is her energy was fantastic. She was 64. She's running her own business out of her home. She was up till like midnight every night cleaning. So energy was fantastic, which is pretty nice to see considering some of these numbers we got back. TSH, the way I break it down to people is TSH is our thyroid stimulating hormone. That's our pituitary talking to our thyroid, telling our thyroid to communicate with the rest of the body through these next two markers, our free T3 and our free T4. Those were actually still in a relatively healthy range for her, which was surprising to see because her TSH was so high. And if we see those next two markers, that anti-TPO antibody, that's pretty definitively diagnostic for our Hashimoto's, especially when we pair it with that thyroglobulin antibody below it. And man, these are nice and elevated. I would like to see these below 20. So seeing a nice high elevation with these, this is probably why we are also seeing this nice high TSH number. So the T3, T4 levels nice and low. So she's probably been dealing with this autoimmune level for a while. And when we have these autoimmune antibody markers high like this, they're actually causing her thyroid cells to lyse open, break open, and release their contents into her body. So this was probably happening originally, probably spiked some of her anxiety. And if we would have ran these labs a while ago, I'm sure that free T3 and free T4 would have been really high, and that TSH would have been really low because her thyroid is hyper communicating with her body. So the pituitary gland would try and tell the thyroid, whoa, slow down. We don't need to put out that much thyroid hormone. So that TSH would have been nice and low. I always like to look at the serum iodine and zinc and selenium because, again, if we're dealing with a lot of destruction to the thyroid gland, these levels, these nutrients that are housed in those thyroid cells are going to be released into the bloodstream. So we knew she was supplementing with iodine. That, is pretty reflective here with her serum iodine level being pretty darn high. So we had her stop that right away so we could try and get a more definitive value for what her baseline was. Other nutrients looked pretty good. Zinc, selenium was well within range. Vitamin D was a little on the low end. We gave her some supplementation for that. And the reason I ran the 4 of these is because these are 4 vital nutrients for thyroid production. Just to even make T3 and T4 in the thyroid gland, we need all 4 of these nutrients in optimal levels.
This is a fantastic slide. Thank you for that synopsis here, Dr. Kelsie. There's a lot going on here. So I have a few questions here, but let's start with what is known as functional or optimal lab range values versus your standard or your conventional lab range values. Can you talk a little bit about those and why that's so important for what we're looking at here in terms of these lab markers?
Yeah, the one I always like to call attention to is TSH, because if you go to your doctor, they might run a TSH, but that's about it. Because if they see it's normal, they're not going to do any deeper digging. The reference range for TSH, I don't know it off the top of my head, but I want to say it's maybe 0.4 to like 4.75. So that's an extremely diverse range. And again, you and me, we have different metabolisms, we have different body types. So we should have a different TSH level, a different optimal range, as opposed to this very wide range that we're seeing. We know that most women function best around a 1.5 to a 2.5 range, definitely a lot lower than what this patient here was dealing with. But there is also, I'll get a lot of patients who are on thyroid medication because their doctor, their endocrinologist is trying to push them towards these optimal thyroid lab numbers. But sometimes we have to kind of base this off of patient symptoms as well. So in this case, sure, we're seeing a nice high autoimmune antibody process attacking the thyroid. But if we weren't dealing with any antibodies, thyroid TSH was a little more normalized, and the patient was feeling great, I wouldn't be super concerned. So yes, we have a nice, marked functional range that we know people function best at. However, we always have to take into account that everybody's individualized, and the goal is to have the patient feeling better and symptom-free, not in that perfect functional range that we kind of use as our baseline.
Exactly. And to touch on that, I think what people often experience when they go to their doctors, and that I really wanted to make sure that we're clarifying here, is this optimal or functional range is a much shorter, narrower range that we use when assessing laboratory markers such as this versus that standard or conventional range. The standard or conventional range is often very wide, meaning you might start with 0.1 all the way up to 10, whereas a more functional or optimal range might be 0.1 or 2 to 3, a very much more narrow range. And the problem with these very large conventional ranges is that actually they don't change year after year. They actually start to expand year after year. They do change, they start to expand, and that is because most of the population continues to get worse year after year. And so when we are comparing our patient up against this conventional lab range value, it's very hard to get a really good idea of what's going on, because everything will be potentially negative, and they'll be always in the middle, and it's normal when you're having these very extreme symptoms and something that needs to be addressed sooner than later. So that's really what I wanted to talk about on some of these optimal ranges or standard ranges, which you kind of have here. And as well, Dr. Kelsie, if you can talk a little bit, you referenced this a little bit, but TSH is this marker that 99% of people get tested at their doctor's office when they are suspecting a thyroid condition. But as you mentioned, this is not indicative of thyroid markers or values or really peripheral activity. This is a marker inside of the brain. So it doesn't actually it does follow downstream, but it doesn't give you a real tangible information about what's going on downstream, only in the brain, which is again why we know that medications such as Thyroid, which is really common, affects this marker so much. Can you talk a little bit about that, Dr. Kelsie, as well?
Yeah, so that is definitely something that drives me crazy, is the amount of patients that I have come in saying, oh, my doctor tested my thyroid, it's totally normal. My TSH is 4.5. I'm like, well, what about the rest? What about thyroid antibody panels? What about actual T3, T4? How is the thyroid actually communicating with the body? It is very undervalued, I guess I want to say, in looking at a full thyroid panel. I would like to call attention to the fact that 1 in 4 women has thyroid imbalance, and of that 1 in 4, 25% of those is due to Hashimoto's thyroiditis. The amount of women I have, men as well, but mostly women, that are coming in on thyroid medication, on that Synthroid, on Armour, that have never even had their antibodies looked at, have raging antibodies, raging Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and none of this is being addressed. And they're coming in with all of our classic thyroid symptoms because nothing's making them feel better. Sure, we're having synthetic thyroid that's now, replacing their own thyroid output, but that pituitary is still trying to communicate with the body. It's still getting signals back from the rest of the body being like, whoa, this isn't enough for us. We need to speed up this metabolism. So we're going to continue to see that TSH climb, and that T3, T4 are still going to be nice and low, especially if we have medication in the picture.
Yeah, you brought up some really good points there, and that's the problem, is this is just not being analyzed from a functional or more really unique perspective to a patient. It's very cookie cutter that many women, obviously a majority of women, are getting out there. And that's why this TSH marker really needs to be like have a red light on it saying, hey, we can't just look at this TSH marker. There's all these other labs we need to address. We really need to look at whether this is a true autoimmune case or a primary hypothyroid situation or whatever it is, a secondary, and really analyze some of these other markers such as zinc, iodine, selenium, vitamin D3 that you mentioned, which are so important just to make thyroid hormone. Now, Dr. Kelsie, we know that TPO, the antibodies, and the thyroglobulin, those are definitive, correct, for Hashimoto's, and that's how we need to actually identify if there's Hashimoto's or not going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
And with this, what's really interesting that you brought up early on, Dr. Kelsie, is that early on, if this patient, as you said, she was 64, she had high energy. But with these antibodies, what can happen, as you mentioned, is they are actually lysing, releasing this thyroid hormone into the body. And as you know, with many patients, but if you can talk a little bit about this, patients early on in their thyroid journey or hypothyroid journey or Hashimoto's journey, they may not know this, but they can actually experience some hyperthyroid symptoms and then hypothyroid symptoms and then hyper and then hypo. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is actually, I think, a big reason why a lot of other docs don't do more thyroid investigation because, again, these symptoms coming and going, they're not really looking like definitive symptoms to these doctors of this being a classical hypothyroid case. I have seen this a lot where we're, working with early Hashimoto's, early autoimmune conditions. And yes, these patients are extremely anxious. They can't sleep. They're extremely hot. Terrible memory fog. I had a patient who had to leave her job, a temporary leave, because she was in such a hyperthyroid acute state from so much attack on this thyroid gland that she was just spilling thyroid hormone or free T3 and free T4 into her bloodstream and hyperstimulating her body. She lost 25 pounds in a couple months. And then she totally swung the other way because she had so much destruction to those thyroid cells that she didn't have a lot of healthy cells left when that process was done. She didn't have enough thyroid cells to put out T3, T4. So then she swung completely the opposite way into a very hypothyroid state. And we saw that TSH just climb through the roof. It was one of the highest TSHs I've seen because of that, again, swinging back and forth. She was lucky to only really have that happen one time. But digging deeper into this patient's history, just looking at anxiety and, again, body temperature change is when I really like to base this off of. She was like, I've definitely gone through multiple highs and low periods following that exact presentation over the last 15 years. So definitely something she was dealing with for a while. And I'm glad that, she came to us when she did. So we were able to acknowledge this.
Fantastic. We could talk about this all day. Again, there's a lot of information. I don't want to spend too much time on the slide. Just again, want to give you as the patient out there, the client, an insight into what some of these labs look like, how we analyze them. And Dr. Kelsie, real quick, you brought up a really good point there. Just want to talk about which is that body temperature, that basal body temperature, which is really a good indicator and a good measure that we are able to analyze with patients as well when they're suffering with suspected or definitive thyroid conditions, whether that's hypo, hyper, you name it. So thank you for going over this. Let's move on to the next slide. So this was the first set of labs that you got with that patient. Let's go on to the follow-up to the review of the labs. Can you talk a little bit about this slide?
Yeah, so we kept it pretty basic just for our first visit. We brought in some just basic supplementation. Her vitamin D, I think, was 34, so I had her start bringing that in. Due to her age, I did suggest she do the vitamin D3 plus K2 due to the fact also that she wasn't very active. So I love including this K2 in there because it does a really nice job of actually helping to bind calcium that's deposited in our blood vessels, redeposit it in our bones. We know osteoporosis is rampant among women in the United States, so this is a really great factor to kind of help prevent that. So always good to include that K2 in there. It also helps maintain healthy levels of vitamin D and kind of prevents your body from building a toxic dose. We always have to be careful with vitamin D. I recommend everybody gets it tested every 6 months because I think everyone should be on vitamin D supplementation depending on where you live. We're in Chicagoland, and I mean, it's March right now and there's no sun out. So where's this vitamin D coming from? So make sure you're getting vitamin D tested because it's fat soluble. It can build up in your body and you can have some nasty symptoms from having a high level of vitamin D. In terms of the other supplement I had her on, it is a glandular thyroid. So this is actually desiccated pork thyroid. It contains actual thyroid components in addition to all of the enzymes in there that are needed to support a thyroid gland. So I had her start with 1 capsule a day, then bump it up to 2. And the main goal of this was to kind of give her body that nice T3, T4 support that she needed to help improve her metabolism, get rid of some of those nasty hypothyroid symptoms she was dealing with, get her feeling a little bit better, and hopefully help improve some of our lab numbers. Again, I had her stop the iodine after we saw how crazy high hers was. 1, to reduce that number, 2, to see if taking out iodine for a period of time and then reintroducing it caused any sort of autoimmune flare with her antibodies. And then diet. Any autoimmune patients, specifically if we're dealing with Hashimoto's, we have to put them on a gluten-free diet, and not just cutting out bread. I mean, gluten is a hidden source in a lot of things: makeup, shampoo, ketchup. So we had to really do a nice deep dive into her house, her body care products, everything she was eating, to really make sure we were cutting out gluten. And the main reason for that is molecular mimicry. So the genetic outline of gluten is actually very similar to our human thyroid cells. So if we, again, I think I mentioned this, have that genetic predisposition to attack gluten, we're going to attack our thyroid cells. So I have some patients where we just put them on a strict gluten-free diet, do a little bit of gut work to kind of help heal up that gut lining, and some of their autoimmune markers totally go away. They go into a state of Hashimoto's remission, and we don't really have to touch it again unless there's something that, you know, stresses their body, or they get gluten, to have some accidental gluten contamination when they're out. And the other thing I recommended that first follow-up visit was a 16 intermittent fasting diet. So the patient, a couple of slides back, we looked at her diet. Breakfast was pretty minimal. I think she was eating just an English muffin. And that's because she, you know, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. I'm supposed to eat breakfast, right? Yes, if it's a good quality breakfast. In her case, it was not. So cutting that out, trying to transition her to a 16-hour intermittent fast was going to help with mainly some of the weight loss we were focusing on, in addition to the fact that anytime we are devoiding the body of food, we're allowing the body to tap into other fat cells and nutritional stores to kind of use those resources up. This was one thing I really wanted to focus on for her because, again, weight gain was a big factor for her. And there was also a really beautiful study looking at long-term fasting, specifically for women, doing a 14-hour fast nightly. And they found that these women had some of the best long-term brain health, lowest incidences of cognitive decline, cognitive dysfunction, Alzheimer's, dementia, all the scary stuff we really want to avoid. So she was very open to that, again, especially because she was someone that forced herself to eat breakfast. So I kind of, you know, broke down intuitive eating as well. If you're not hungry in the morning, let's skip it. You're eating 2 very complete meals a day. Let's focus on those and bring in a nice snack between as well. So we're hitting our protein, fat, and carbohydrate requirements for the day.
Love it. Thank you for that, Dr. Kelsie. That was fantastic. There's a lot of really good information on the slide. So let's break it down a little bit just here. So I want to talk right at the top here. You mentioned this D3 plus K2, a lot of really good points there, specifically related to how that D3 is going into the body, right? You're kind of using that K2 directing that D3. And you talked about how we're able to help to manage some of that calcification or that calcium level, in the bloodstream, which, as you mentioned, so important with the cardiovascular system, is that's really what can help to, again, calcify and really wreak havoc in that cardiovascular system. Thank you for talking about it. So important to discuss. And as you mentioned, can you talk a little bit about this? D3 is that fat-soluble vitamin, that A, D, E, and K, those 4 fat-soluble vitamins. How can people develop this toxicity with a fat-soluble vitamin, right? You think, well, it's just a vitamin, it's going to eliminate. But can you talk a little bit about the difference between these fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins and why you can, say, get a D3 toxicity?
Yeah, so you, just kind of broke it down in the name itself. Water soluble. These are most of our B vitamins, a lot of our antioxidants. These are going to be flushed out of our body. They don't bind to our fat cells like our good fat solubles, A, E, D, and K do. I will commonly see some of my patients that are overweight continually supplementing with vitamin D, and those levels aren't going up as well because those vitamin D levels are actually, these vitamin D molecules are actually being sequestered into the fat cells, and then they just hang out in the fat cells. So with her, we weren't doing any overt weight loss support. Sure, we're bringing in some fasting, but it was a slower transition for her to get there. I didn't say do a 16-hour fast tomorrow. Let's start. Let's go. No, we pushed her breakfast back 30 minutes each day. or about every like 4 or 5 days, until we were hitting this 16-hour window, because I didn't want her to lose weight too quickly, because that could even flood her body with the vitamin D, as well as potentially some of these other fat soluble vitamins that she could have been storing in her fat cells.
Amazing point you brought up there as well. And this is so important. And this is what we really focus on with patients is we have to ease patients into programs, such as when we're working with functional medicine. This is something that's so unique to a patient. And as you just put, Dr. Kelsie, and you know this firsthand, that when we work with patients, we can't just, again, throw a 16-hour fast at them once, every day.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, one, that's going to spike their cortisol and put them into that major stress mode. And then they're going to start flooding their system with all these other nutrients, not nutrients, actually toxins and other things that are stored in that fat. And we know that if we do that, we're actually predisposing them to even a worse symptomology and a worse autoimmune condition, or adding another autoimmune condition onto their current one, because it's just so much stress, so much toxin leading into the body, and that is just another massive added stress to that patient. So really glad you brought that up. Super, super important. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the glandular thyroid. As you mentioned, this again is so important. As you said on here, you mentioned on your notes that you're starting with 1 capsule in the morning. And as you put early on in this presentation, that timing is so important. And can you talk a little bit again, just as a reminder for everybody watching, why it's 1 capsule in the morning, and why not one at just starting at night, or why one not at midday, why not in the middle of the night, etc.?
Yeah. So thyroid and hormones are most active first thing in the morning. There is a really big response in terms of our cortisol boost that happens around, like, ideally 7 a.m., that cortisol awakening response. This stimulates a lot of metabolism work, and this communicates directly with thyroid. So that's really when we want to hone in on some of that thyroid activity first thing in the morning. The reason I brought it in at night was, I think, actually after experience in the past, when I've had people do 2 in the morning, I was having some issues with them having anxiety at night. Some of those hypothyroid symptoms were coming back in the evening and preventing them from sleeping. So with her high anxiety level, one of the biggest things that was affecting her sleep was this anxiety. So we were trying to kind of compensate for that, see if we could spread out this dosage to really slowly release that glandular thyroid into her system to help keep the thyroid nice, calm, and not overactive.
Beautiful. Another perfect example here about working with the patient on their own health, not just a cookie cutter approach. If your patient is experiencing that type of symptoms, we want to make sure that we're modulating the plan so that they're getting the best possible outcome, not just continuing to bang on the wall and try the same thing over and over again if it's not working. And as you mentioned, most thyroid is most active in the morning. That's why those of you who are watching, if you're on Synthroid or levothyroxine or some of these other thyroid medications, you're always taking it in the morning for those purposes. You talked about the iodine usage, linking with the increased autoimmune activity as well already. And then most importantly as well down here is you talked about this gluten-free diet as it relates to Hashimoto's and autoimmunity and that molecular mimicry. It's so important. And as you put, Dr. Kelsie, and this is so very interesting that the body does. And if you can talk a little bit more about this, as this is common in other autoimmune conditions as well, where gluten is very similar and looks like the thyroid proteins, but you also have microbes that look like other proteins in the body. You have also different types of other foods that look like other proteins, and the body can just get these confused. And now if it starts attacking one, the composition of that chemical structure is so similar, and that's why it's called that molecular mimicry. If you can touch on that, as again, that's related to other microbes and other things in the body that they react to.
Yeah, there is some really nice panels out there that actually can help your body identify if you are attacking any other foods. A lot of times if I have my patients cut out gluten, they're like, oh, well, I've been doing a lot of oats as well. That's kind of how I've replaced my gluten. Oats are another example of molecular mimicry. Again, the genetic structure of that is very similar to gluten. So if you are reacting to gluten on an autoimmune level, you are likely reacting to a couple other foods as well due to that essentially confusion of our body, mislabeling it as offensive and foreign. And bacterial influence is pretty notorious for fueling this process as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And lastly, Dr. Kelsie, I know we're going to move on to the next slide here. There's just so much good information just to talk on this slide again. Can you talk about some of the benefits of this intermittent fasting that when you're able to modulate it and modify and also manage and kind of be a part of it, so that you're monitoring it with the patient, as we do with all of our patients that come with us. What are some of the benefits, especially when we're working with autoimmune patients and thyroid patients, for example, in the gut, for example, with just recovery and all of those other things?
Yeah, definitely. So, in my opinion, I think most of us should be doing some sort of fasting. Again, I kind of rotate most of my recommendations around a 14-hour fast. Hormones, especially for women throughout the month, can cause you to kind of negate that process. And I allow people to break their fast. If you're just starving one day, you wake up, maybe you had a hard workout the day before, we really need to kind of ramp up protein and caloric intake. That's a good time to, throw the fast away for a day or two. One thing I really love about fasting is a lot of my patients, when they fully transition to it, they can't believe their energy. You're like, I'm not eating any food. How am I having this great energy in the morning? Why am I sleeping fantastic? I always kind of relate this back to our ancestral evolution. So our current lifestyle, living, in buildings and cities, is about 1% of our genetic evolution. So 99% of our ancestry was essentially living off the land. They were eating 1 to 2 meals a day, very big, bulky meals. Not continually eating, snacking throughout the day between our 3 meals, eating those 3 meals close together. One of the big things we work on is digestion. And I see so many bacterial issues from overeating. When we're continually bringing food into our mouths, it's like an unlimited buffet for the bugs in our gut. So yes, they're going to diversify. Yes, we're going to spike our blood sugar, get metabolic issues, which then in itself is inflammatory and then can further contribute to some of these lovely autoimmune conditions and markers.
Beautiful. Thank you for touching on that. And exactly, you put it very eloquently there. That is the absolute truth. Let's move on to the next slide here. So this is 2 months in, you got another follow-up on their labs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we started to see some nice improvements, as we can see some of those thyroid antibodies at the bottom are starting to go down. TSH is starting to normalize very quickly. This patient jumped into fasting, the diet recommendations, cut all the gluten out. I think like the second she walked out of that visit, she was like, I'm changing everything. So normally I don't see this robust of a response right away. And then one thing we did run as well, due to the high anxiety, I wanted to make sure she wasn't creating something called reverse T3, which is essentially our thyroid puts out a high level of T4, a small amount of T3, and then that T4 is then converted to our hyperactive thyroid hormone T3 in our peripheral body. So if we're dealing with overt nutrient deficiencies, or in her case, high stress levels, we can convert that T4 into a non-usable form of T3 called this reverse T3, which looks like T3, but it's not active in our body. So if that's the case, that would kind of cause us to divert treatment a little bit and work more so on her stress response. But reverse T3 looked good. And that marker right above it, that first one we're seeing, that salivary cortisol, also was well within range for that 8 a.m. Time that she went in to get that lab drawn.
Thank you. Yes, such an important marker, that reverse T3. Again, very commonly missed in that traditional setting. Many patients have never even heard the word reverse T3, much less they gotten tested on them, but extremely important. As you mentioned, it is inactive, just like T4 is inactive. We need to know the active forms and what is going on, why a cell is not becoming active, or why that T3 is not in the usual markers, in the normal optimal range there. So as you put, I'm glad you touched on this reverse T3 and T4 into this mix of markers. In addition, you ran this salivary cortisol. Now, cortisol is that major stress hormone. Can you talk a little bit about this and why this is so important as it relates to thyroid function and the interworkings of those?
Definitely. So the way I kind of break down the thyroid to my patients is I call it the canary in the gold mine. It is our most sensitive gland in our body. Something I want to point out, women, we're spraying perfume right on our thyroid, right here, right on our neck. So bringing in all these nice, damaging factors, endocrine disruptors, things like that are going to cause inflammation. And this kind of circles back to cortisol. Cortisol, when we have high levels of cortisol throughout the day, we like to see a nice diurnal variation. Start nice and high with cortisol in the morning, melatonin's nice and low. Throughout the day, these inversely switch. So around midnight, melatonin's nice and high, cortisol is at its lowest. If we're dealing with a hyper stressed out, anxious person, that cortisol is going to stay nice and high all day. Cortisol does a great job of messing up your blood sugar, causing some nice inflammatory reactions in your body, decreasing your immune system function. Directly can lead to leaky gut as well. So anytime we're dealing with high stress, high anxiety patients, we always have to make sure that cortisol is well within a healthy range and not potentially influencing or fueling this autoimmune process. With her specifically, cortisol looked great, which was great considering she was a high anxiety patient for a long time. Something that would have been nice to do with her would be a full day cortisol level. So looking at cortisol samples morning, mid-morning, afternoon, and evening to see that nice, again, ebbs and flows of that cortisol throughout the day. That wasn't available to us at the time, but the fact that we saw that her cortisol output first thing in the morning was pretty nice, it seemed like a pretty good marker for us to go on and kind of take that as a, no longer a factor in the equation for her autoimmune process.
Absolutely. Thank you for talking about it a little bit further. It's just such an important marker to look at as it relates to thyroid hormone. As again, in addition to what you mentioned, cortisol will directly block that T4 to T3 production. It'll directly block that TSH production at the level of the brain as well for the thyroid hormone pathway. So just insanely important from a number of perspectives, as you mentioned, again, from gut function, blood sugar, you name it in the body, super important. The great thing is, again, at 2 months, just 2 months in, this patient's lab work is significantly improved. And we're doing this about every 6 to 8 weeks on average, I think is what, if we're dealing with specific thyroid markers that we're looking at. When it comes to other labs, and if you could briefly touch on this as well, timing of labs, we know that annual labs, you really generally want to get a good blood workup every 6 months. Your labs can change very quickly, and somebody can go from healthy to anemic in literally 120 days. And so when it comes to thyroid labs specifically, things like this is only 8 weeks in, generally 6 to 8 weeks looking at specific thyroid markers, generally at least 3 to 4 months when assessing any stool tests or other more in-depth functional labs, and generally 6 months when looking at annual lab work if you're in good, healthy range. But if you can talk about that a little bit more as well, Dr. Kelsie.
Yeah, definitely. So normally I don't see improvements this quickly. I do try and rerun my thyroid labs at about that 8 week mark, just so we know that we're on the right track and heading in the right direction. Especially because if we're not getting the right cause and source of this autoimmune condition, we're not going to see any improvement. So something like this, when we're trying to tease out possible mechanisms of action for what is the root cause for this autoimmune process, we need to be a little more diligent about following up with those antibodies to make sure that our target treatment is just that, targeted, and we're kind of hitting the nail on the head with what we want to get her good results.
Absolutely. Thank you for touching on that a little bit. All right, let's move on to the next slide. This is your follow-up with the patient after the labs came in.
Yeah. Yep. So this was, that same visit. I mean, she was super, super happy with some of these results. The biggest improvement was that reduction in anxiety. No longer anxious. She was sleeping great at night. She was dreaming nightly, feeling really well rested in the morning. She had lost a bunch of weight, definitely faster than I would like to see. My normal weight loss is about 1 pound a week, but we didn't follow up till that 8-week mark. And so when she told me she had lost this much weight in that short amount of time, I was a little concerned, but she didn't have any overt symptoms of the toxicity that can come along with that. And she was so diligent about eating really good liver supportive foods. And she was back to having nice daily bowel movements that I wasn't super concerned about a toxicity level in her because her elimination methods and elimination routes were tip top shape. Let's see what else I have in here. So we just had her stick with some good whole food forms of zinc, magnesium, selenium, and iodine. Again, I took out the iodine supplementation. She was eating fish about once a week. So I think we bumped that up to twice a week. And I had her start bringing in some dulse and kelp flakes, just sprinkling that on her salad every day. So she was getting, again, natural sources of iodine. And exercise was huge. So she lost all of this weight just by doing dietary work alone. So I wanted to bring in some of that good exercise support, yes, for the weight loss, but also to help stimulate detoxification, get her blood and lymphatics moving well so she could help clear anything that was released from the fat cells. And there we go. Liver support handout provided with functional foods. Dandelion root tea was recommended to help stimulate liver detoxification, liver processing, and help maintain hydration, which was going to be key because she's ramping up her exercise amount. And we also really wanted to support another route of detoxification, which is urination, and make sure that that was effectively eliminating anything that could be hanging around from that fast weight loss.
Some really good points here, Dr. Kelsie, specifically on the detoxing. And that's kind of a misnomer, as we're all detoxing on a daily basis. But in the sense that you're doing with the patient, obviously you're stimulating those detoxification routes through the urine, through the through the exhalation of the lungs, through sweat, and more. So, in this sense, that's really important. Can you talk a little bit about why that is important from these number of perspectives? Because as you mentioned, a lot of these fat cells or these toxins are stored in the fat, but we need to obviously optimize all routes of detoxification when working with patients.
Yeah, so you definitely did a good job touching on them. Urination, digestion, sweating, breathing. Those are really, and skin. Those are our main routes of elimination and detoxification. And yes, we're doing this every second of every day. However, if we live in a area that's potentially close to a city, again, I'm in Chicagoland area, we're continually dealing with some nice, toxic chemicals, exhaust, anything that's being sprayed on the plants, even in our groundwater and the water that we're drinking, unfortunately, a lot of toxins there. In addition to the fact that this woman was overweight and she was a female. So estrogen was definitely something I was concerned about. Estrogen does a lovely job of slowing down liver processing. So we really wanted to make sure that liver was functioning to help eliminate everything it was bringing in. And that it was going to be able to keep up with the continual weight loss that was going to be fueled from bringing in some exercise and her sticking with the diet.
Yes, you brought up again some fantastic points here. This is so important that this is a continual process that's going on in our bodies. This is why it's so important to educate our patients on all of these things. Again, from the water you're drinking to the air you're breathing. This is what we work on inside of the program as well. And I'm glad you touched on this, Dr. Kelsie. One last thing on this slide here that you mentioned, this patient had such significant improvements in just 2 months, in just 8 weeks. But I want to remind, for those of you that are watching, your symptomology is not always going to correlate with your labs accordingly. Mm-hmm. And so, Dr. Kelsie, if you can talk about that, because sometimes it can be misleading. And this is why we want to make sure that we are getting the lab values as well, following up on those in addition to your symptoms improving, so that both of them are on the same page. If you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. So again, a lot of what I really base things on is, yes, we have our functional ranges that we know people function best at. If I'm trying to help a lady get pregnant, yes, these ranges are extremely, extremely important to kind of get within that narrow range. But in this patient's case, we really base a lot of it off of symptomology. It was beautiful to see these labs reflect that as well. Checking in, making sure the patient is improving from, yes, a functional standpoint. We want to improve their quality of life, their daily living. That is the main goal of us and what we're doing to help these patients. So the fact that she was seeing these great improvements, awesome. That I figured was a gold star. We were doing a great job. When we got these lab results back and they just reflected that, that was an even, better job on her end, that she was doing this great work to see these great values in response to everything. But again, a big factor I was really looking at was, is she sleeping? Is her anxiety down? Are bowel movements better? Is skin health better? Is all of these, symptoms that are correlated with this hypothyroid condition improving for her so that life is just a little bit better?
Exactly. We just want to make sure that we're assessing both from a objective standpoint as well as an objective standpoint. And sometimes the objective and subjectives don't match perfectly, especially early on in the beginning. And some patients may get discouraged based on their labs or based on their subjective findings, or vice versa. They may get a little bit ahead of themselves and say, I feel great, but their labs are not correlating that. So we want to make sure that we're doing our best to at least get those as close as possible together. But this is why making sure that we're following a proper program and route to get there in the long run is the key to success there. So let's move on to the next slide here. So we're 4 months in now. We just went from 2 months for 4 months. Dr. Kelsie, can you take us down this slide?
Yeah, so just kind of as I expected, the patient continued to shed a decent amount of weight. At this point, she was down 40 pounds. Was loving the gluten-free diet, the intermittent fasting, sleeping better energy. She was working out 25 minutes a day on an exercise bike. She was building lean muscle. She said that it was easier walking up the stairs, carrying groceries, all the little things that we don't really think about. Skin was also a really beautiful improvement that we saw. The dryness on the hands and feet. I'm a chiropractor as well, so I was adjusting her on occasion, and after she would get off my table early on, there would be skin flakes on the table. That's how dry her skin was. And that's a lot of energy for your body to continually work to put out new skin cells, in addition to the good essential fatty acids that are lost with that high frequent cell turnover. And then there's one of my favorite things to always look at, anxiety, 1 out of 10. She was doing daily meditation, which has so many benefits. She was just doing great. She was really, really happy with her results. I was really happy with it. And let's see if we have some lab results to reflect that.
Yes, absolutely. Again, this is such a good slide. We're only 4 months in. Patient has significant improvements. This is not a abnormal type of result. When we are following the proper protocols and steps and making sure that we're really going in depth in your own specific history and making sure that we're doing everything that's good for your body, this is not an abnormal thing. You should be progressing very well in 4 months' time. Again, this is give or take. Every patient is different, but a majority of the time, these are the types of results we want to see. So here are the 4-month labs, Dr. Kelsie.
Beautiful. So that TSH spiked back up again, and we see this sometimes when we do have rapid weight loss because, again, it is a bit of a stressor on the body. But the main factor I wanted to look at was those antibodies. Look at that continuing to go down. Thyroglobulin antibody still a little bit elevated, but that anti-TPO antibody was really what I was really happy to see, continuing to climb down. That vitamin D was finally in a nice healthy range, and this is after 4 months of supplementation. So that coupled with the weight loss definitely got us some good reactions and good results. And then something else I want to point out. So that you mentioned kind of on the last slide with labs and symptoms not necessarily being reflective. It can take a minute for the thyroid to restore itself. Again, she's actually having to regrow thyroid cells. She's having to form a new thyroid gland due to the long-term destruction she had going on. So it's still surprising that her labs were so responsive to her ongoing treatment so quickly. But a lot of times with a patient like that, when I have antibody levels that high, I normally won't see really vast improvements in some of these lab values till 4 months, till 6 months, because it just takes a while for the body to ramp back up to its full capacity. It's good vital energy that we want to see to help heal and stimulate growth of that thyroid gland itself.
Yes, absolutely. Again, as you mentioned, these things can take time. They don't develop overnight. Often this is years and years, often not decades in the making. And so 4 months in, again, subjective findings and symptomology, fantastic, improving like amazing. Sometimes the labs can take a little bit longer, as you mentioned. That's why we want to make sure that these are correlating and we're following it accordingly. And it looks like you also wanted to run a GI map stool panel. Can you talk a little bit about further treatment that you thought might be best for the patient as well?
Yeah, definitely. So again, she was a little bit of a unique case, but anytime I have someone with an autoimmune condition come in, I always start with gut health. Let's look at the gut. Let's see the inflammation level. Let's look at the bacterial load. Let's look and make sure there's nothing pathogenic or parasitic in there. So we discussed this in depth, especially because I believe at this time she mentioned that she was now dealing with a little bit of slow transit. So this could have been due to, again, that TSH level spiking up. Her T3, T4 could have gone down a little bit in regards to that. And so that could have slowed down some of her transit time, as constipation is a nice common symptom of hypothyroid. I believe at the time she was not open to running the GI map because it was such a transient issue. I think it had only been a week or two that she'd been dealing with this. And it just so happened we had this follow-up visit that it became, it came up. But so we just did some basic dietary interventions. We talked about actually cutting out the salads for a period of time and moving to purely cooked fiber. So I had her cook all of her vegetables just to reduce the demand on the gastric system, allow that to, kind of heal and recuperate a little bit. Hydration, she had been a little busy at work, I believe. So water intake had ticked down a little bit. So we wanted to boost that back up. We know hydration is one of the most important factors when it comes to nice, healthy bowel movements. And I believe she had probably seen a little bit of undigested food in her stool, in one of the stools that she'd passed. And that's why we brought in some of those digestive enzymes as well, as just a little bit of a trial to see if that helped. 2 weeks, the constipation didn't resolve. I wanted her to come back in and run that GI maps. But after 1 week, she was back to normal. And I did not see her again for any gastric or GI issues.
Beautiful. Again, very important, as you're mentioning, This is a very case-by-case basis. Each patient and client may need something different depending on what comes up in their history. So this is just a normal thing to see. Again, as we are really going in depth in each person's history, goals, and more, these are things that we always want to assess. So we are 6 months in. Can you talk a little bit more about this, Dr. Kelsie?
Yes. So there's that TSH swing. I believe on the last page is around 21. So it seems like that had normaled out pretty well. Again, 1.5 to 2.5 is kind of my ideal functional range for TSH for her age group. That anti-TPO antibody continues to improve. Thyroglobulin also continuing to improve. So over the 6 months period, we've seen a really nice decrease in both of these antibody levels. We continued with the diet. We actually kind of shifted her a little bit to an overt paleo diet just because she was interested in trying a little more dietary work to continue with some of the weight loss that we had seen. We talked about an autoimmune paleo diet that cut out a big portion of nightshades, which was a huge portion of her diet. I told her if we didn't continue to see these autoimmune antibody numbers drop, then we would do a trial paleo or autoimmune paleo. We even talked about doing a food sensitivity panel to see if there was anything specifically that she was reacting to on an IgG level. But that I don't believe we ended up running any of that. That was just all stuff we talked about for our follow-up based off of how her antibodies continued to look. So if we're just looking at that last bullet point there, again, kind of touching on all of my main factors for autoimmune instigators. Stool panel, GI, we have to look at microbiota and gastrointestinal lining, make sure there's no leaky gut, no dysbiosis going on that could be contributing to an autoimmune flare. Food sensitivities, beautiful cause of autoimmune issues in itself, so we talked about that. Metals, molds, mycotoxins, and environmental toxins is also in this panel I like to run. All of these are factors that, we don't really see them. She ate a really great plant-based diet. She was putting mushrooms in her salad every single day. Mushrooms are fantastic, but they're also fantastic at sucking nutrients, heavy metals out of the ground, and can be pretty culpable for being high heavy metal contaminants. Her house didn't really have any red flags for mold or mycotoxin toxicity, but we still had to talk about it in case she was living potentially in a place that was water damaged before. Eating a lot of, old grains, even old spices are pretty notorious for containing mold. And then a micronutrient panel. So we did look at some basic nutrients with the blood work, but this micronutrient panel we do is a little more functional. It's actually looking at your nutrient need in your body, not an actual stagnant level. So that would actually kind of give us some insight into methylation pathways, her energetic pathways as well, energetic catabolism, how she's processing energy, fat, protein, all of that good stuff to see if there's any kind of kinks in that chain that could be resulting in overt nutrient deficiencies or in the autoimmune process itself.
Yeah, this is really important what you went over here, Dr. Kelsie, especially this last point, in that there's many different aspects of where we need to look from a functional perspective. We have to look at the GI tract. Where are these autoimmune processes occurring? We know that an autoimmune condition is where the body starts mistaking your own tissue and starts attacking it. And so the question is, where did that immune system go off kilter? Is it in the digestive tract where about 80% or so of the immune system is supposed to lie? Is it due to food sensitivities that the body's starting to react to? Is it due to excess metals or molds or mycotoxins, again, maybe exposures or in the foods or elsewhere in the body? Is it due to excess nutrient deficiencies caused by maybe a infection in the gut, whether that's a bacterial or a fungal or a parasitic or more? All of these things that you mentioned are so important and that are all part of that functional medicine perspective and spectrum that we look at. With this patient in particular, of course, everybody is at a different aspect, and some patients are not fully ready to do the full gamut of testing for a variety of reasons. So in this presentation here on this case study on this Hashimoto's patient, we were not able to run those full gamut of testing. Now, a majority of our patients do get that full gamut of testing, but what's fantastic about this is just looking at this 6-month follow-up, how significant of an improvement this patient made without really diving down an even deeper pathway, as we could do a full video on all the other testing I normally do on these patients, but this would be an 8-hour video that we would have to take breaks on and everything. So in this short video that we're really covering this in-depth approach to a thyroid type of case of Hashimoto's, we're still able to give you a really good perspective of what this looks like, the analysis, and then really the clinical thinking process of what we're doing for the patient. So I'm so excited to show you and that Dr. Kelsie, you were able to give for this patient the results here, that these TPO antibodies are significantly lower, thyroid globulin antibodies significantly lower, that TSH has stabilized out, and the actual digestive issues and a lot of these other symptoms are actually progressing and have fallen off. So again, fantastic job here. And I think we're on the last slide. So if you want to wrap it up here for us.
Yeah. So again, all those testing, the additional testing, looking deeper into that autoimmune process was all kind of weighing or based on her follow-up labs. If we did not see those autoimmune markers continuing to drop, then we would have circled back to that. But she continued to see improvements, whether or from a functional lab standpoint, those lab values continued to improve. And symptoms. I mean, she continued to lose weight. She stuck to the diet religiously. She was continuing to just improve other aspects of her life, the meditation, working on mental health, keeping stress nice and low, and then exercise is huge. So, I mean, she's a beautiful case study because we saw some really great improvements with some very minor and minimal, treatment modalities on our end. A lot of this really was just kind of looking at the labs, looking at where those possible kinks in the chain are that could be leading to some of this autoimmune, and then giving her the tools to do the work herself. Because, I mean, unfortunately, that's what health is. You got to put in the work.
Absolutely. It is certainly a interactive or active process. We cannot just sit back and expect our health to get better, just like we can't expect anything to get better if we don't work on it. So absolutely. Thank you for going over this patient case history consult here today. This is a really, really good example of a Hashimoto's type patient that you worked with, Dr. Kelsie, at the Crifase Institute. And this is just really good information for those of you that are watching. Again, just a quick reminder, this is a very unique case to this patient. Each patient is different. Every patient has different types of things that they need to work on. And this is, again, why functional medicine is so beautiful, that there's so many different ways to help each patient, but it makes it very enjoyable for the practitioner to work with patients as well. So I'm going to unshare screen, and I think we're going to go back here. So Dr. Kelsie, thank you so much again for your presentation today. Beautiful. You did a really great job with this patient. They got great results, which is what we want to see. On average, we're working with our patients roughly about 6 to 9 months. And so these are the types of results that most patients end up seeing. We want patients to get better. That is our goal. And so again, if you are watching this video, I hope that you found this helpful, educational. And if you're dealing with these types of conditions such as Hashimoto's, thyroid, or other hyper, Graves' disease, you name it, give our office a call. You can schedule a consultation with Dr. Kelsie if you'd like, and we can always look over all of your labs. We have a collaborative effort with all of our providers on staff to make sure that you are getting the most effective and most comprehensive treatment and therapy and clinical consultation in the background from your provider. So again, Dr. Kelsie, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we'll see you all next time.